In the heat of combat, when bullets are flying and lives hang in the balance, there are moments that define legends. One simple question, "What's your call sign?" would reveal a warrior whose reputation preceded her into every dangerous mission. She was known only as Sticky Six, a name that struck fear into enemies and brought hope to allies. But behind that legendary call sign was a story of courage, sacrifice, and an unbreakable spirit that would prove why some people are simply born to be heroes. This is the true story of how one woman earned a name that would echo through military history, and why those who serve alongside her would never forget the day they learned what Sticky Six truly meant. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the forward operating base as Captain Sarah Martinez stepped out of the transport helicopter. Dust swirled around her boots, and the familiar smell of jet fuel and sand filled her nostrils. She had been stationed at dozens of bases throughout her military career, but this one felt different. There was tension in the air, something that went beyond the usual stress of deployment. Sarah had earned her reputation as one of the finest helicopter pilots in the military. At 32, she had already logged over 3,000 flight hours in some of the most dangerous regions of the world. Her record was spotless, her skills unmatched, and her dedication absolute. But none of that mattered right now as she walked toward the operations tent, her gear bag slung over her shoulder. The base commander, Colonel Williams, was a gruff man in his 50s who had seen more combat than most soldiers could imagine. He looked up as Sarah entered the tent, his weathered face showing a mixture of relief and concern. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the maps and charts that covered every available surface. "Captain Martinez," he said, standing to shake her hand. "We've been waiting for you. I trust your flight and was smooth." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady and professional. "Ready for briefing whenever you are." Colonel Williams gestured to a chair across from his desk. The tent was stifling hot despite the fans running in each corner, and Sarah could already feel sweat beginning to form under her flight suit. Outside, she could hear the constant hum of activity that never stopped at a forward base. Generators running, vehicles moving, and the distant sound of radio chatter. "I'll be straight with you, Martinez," the colonel began, pulling out a thick folder. "We've got a situation here that's been escalating for the past 6 weeks. Intelligence suggests enemy forces are using a network of caves in the mountains about 40 kilometers north of here as a base of operations. They've been hitting our supply convoys with increasing frequency." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her attention fully focused on every word. She had flown similar missions before, dangerous insertions into hostile territory where one wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. The mountains the colonel was describing were notoriously difficult to navigate, with unpredictable wind patterns and limited landing zones. "What's the mission profile?" she asked. Colonel Williams spread out an aerial photograph on his desk. The image showed rugged terrain with steep cliffs and narrow valleys. Red marks indicated known enemy positions, while blue marks showed potential landing zones. Most of the blue marks have been crossed out with red ink. "We need to insert a special operations team into this area," he said, pointing to a valley that looked impossibly narrow. "The mission is reconnaissance initially, but there's a high probability it will turn into direct action. The problem is every pilot we've sent up there has had to abort due to enemy fire or impossible landing conditions." Sarah studied the photograph carefully, her trained eye picking out details that others might miss. She could see why previous missions had failed. The approach routes were limited, and the landing zones were in clear sight of elevated enemy positions. It would require precision flying and nerves of steel. "How many failed attempts?" she asked. "4," the colonel replied grimly. "We lost one bird 2 weeks ago. Pilot and crew made out alive, but barely. The enemy seems to know we're coming before we even get close." Sarah nodded slowly, processing the information. She had flown enough combat missions to know that sometimes success came down to more than just skill and courage. Sometimes it required a willingness to take calculated risks that others wouldn't take. Sometimes it required thinking differently than everyone else. "When do you want to try again?" she asked. Colonel Williams looked surprised. "You haven't even seen the full briefing yet. Don't you want to study the approach routes? Talk to the pilots who attempted the mission." "I'll do all of that," Sarah said. "But I'm here to fly missions, not to find reasons why they can't be done." The colonel smiled for the first time since she had arrived. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. Your reputation preceded you, Martinez. Word is that you can put a helicopter anywhere, anytime." "I can," Sarah replied without boasting. It was simply a statement of fact. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah immersed herself in mission planning. She spoke with the pilots who had attempted the insertion, studied weather patterns, and examined every piece of intelligence available about enemy positions and capabilities. The more she learned, the more she understood why the missions had failed. Each previous attempt had followed predictable patterns. The helicopters approached from the south, following established flight corridors that provided some protection from enemy fire. They attempted to land in the designated landing zones during daylight hours when visibility was best. They used standard insertion techniques that had worked in other theaters of operation. But this wasn't other theaters of operation. This was a unique situation that required a unique solution. Sarah spent the evening walking around the base, observing the daily routines, and talking with personnel. She learned that supply flights always came in from the east, that medical evacuations always used the same approach pattern, and that enemy forces had been observing these patterns for weeks. That night, lying in her bunk in the temporary quarters assigned to female personnel, Sarah stared at the ceiling and thought about the mission. The sound of generators and distant radio chatter provided a constant background hum, occasionally interrupted by the roar of aircraft taking off or landing. She thought about the special operations team that was waiting for insertion. These were highly trained soldiers who had volunteered for an extremely dangerous mission. They were depending on her to get them into position so they could do their job. The success of their mission could save lives and disrupt enemy operations that were threatening coalition forces throughout the region. But more than that, Sarah thought about the pilots who had tried and failed. She knew them by reputation, and they were good pilots. If they couldn't make the insertion work using conventional methods, then conventional methods weren't going to work. The next morning, Sarah requested a meeting with Colonel Williams and the Special Operations Team leader, a quiet, intense man named Major Thompson. The three of them sat in the operations tent as Sarah spread out her own annotated maps and photographs. "I've been thinking about this mission all night," she began. "Every previous attempt has failed for the same reason: predictability. The enemy knows when we're coming, how we're coming, and where we're going." Major Thompson leaned forward. "What are you proposing?" Sarah pointed to the map. "Night insertion. Not just any night insertion. We go in during the new moon when visibility is minimal. We approach from the north, coming over the mountains instead of through the valleys. And we don't use any of the designated landing zones." Colonel Williams frowned. "That approach puts you right over the highest concentration of enemy positions." "Exactly," Sarah said. "They'll be watching the valleys and the established approach routes. They won't expect us to come straight over their heads." "And the landing zone?" Major Thompson asked. Sarah pointed to an area on the map that had been marked as unsuitable for helicopter operations. "There's a narrow ridge about 2 kilometers from the primary target area. According to the topographical data, it's just wide enough for one skid. We can hover drop your team and be gone before anyone knows what happened." Colonel Williams studied the map carefully. "That ridge is barely 20 feet wide, and the approach requires flying through a canyon with walls on both sides. If you lose engine power or take enemy fire, there's no way out," Sarah finished. "I know, but if we do it right, there won't be any enemy fire because they won't see us coming until it's too late." The room fell silent as both men considered her proposal. What Sarah was suggesting was extremely dangerous, but it was also completely different from anything that had been tried before. Sometimes the most dangerous option was also the safest, because it was the one the enemy would never expect. Major Thompson was the first to speak. My team can handle a hover drop onto a narrow ridge. The question is whether you can get us there. Sarah looked him directly in the eyes. I can get you there. Colonel Williams sighed heavily. This is going to require approval from higher up the chain. A night insertion over hostile territory using an untested approach route. It's not something I can authorize on my own. How long will that take? Sarah asked. 24 to 48 hours. Then, we go in 2 nights from now, Sarah said, during the new moon. As the meeting broke up and plans began to take shape, none of them knew that this mission would become the stuff of military legend. None of them knew that by the end of the week, the name Sticky Six will be spoken with reverence and off throughout the entire theater of operations. But Sarah Martinez, as she began her final preparations for what would prove to be the most challenging mission of her career, had a feeling that something significant was about to happen. She could sense in the way her crew looked at her, in the way other pilots stopped talking as she walked by, and in the way Colonel Williams kept shaking his head as he read and reread her mission proposal. The desert sun was setting as she walked to the flight line to inspect her aircraft. Tomorrow would be spent in final preparations and equipment checks. The day after that, when darkness fell and the moon was nothing more than a thin sliver in the star-filled sky, she would find out if her plan would work. She would find out if she really could put a helicopter anywhere, anytime. And in doing so, she would discover exactly why her call sign would become legendary. The hangar was dimly lit in the pre-dawn hours as Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection. Her hands moved methodically over every surface of the Black Hawk helicopter, checking for any sign of wear, damage, or mechanical issues. This wasn't just routine maintenance. This was the detailed examination of a machine that would soon carry 8 lives into the most dangerous airspace in the region. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, her crew chief, worked alongside her with the same meticulous attention to detail. Rodriguez had been flying with Sarah for over 2 years, and they had developed the kind of professional relationship that only came from trusting each other completely in life-or-death situations. He was a compact man in his mid-20s with steady hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of helicopter systems. Hydraulics are good, Rodriguez called out from beneath the aircraft. No leaks, pressure holding steady. Roger that, Sarah replied, checking the rotor blade attachments. Each bolt had to be perfect, each connection absolutely secure. There would be no opportunity for mechanical failures where they were going. The mission had been approved 12 hours earlier, though Sarah suspected that Colonel Williams had called in several favors to make it happen. The official authorization had come with a long list of conditions and contingencies, but the bottom line was simple. They had permission to attempt the insertion using her proposed route and methods. As Sarah continued her inspection, other members of the team arrived at the hangar. Major Thompson's special operations team consisted of 6 highly trained soldiers, each carrying specialized equipment for their reconnaissance mission. They moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had worked together countless times before. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, the team's communications specialist, was checking her radio equipment when she noticed Sarah's call sign painted on the side of the helicopter. The letters Sticky Six were barely visible in the dim light, but Santos squinted to make them out. "Excuse me, Captain," Santos said, approaching Sarah. "I couldn't help but notice your call sign. Sticky Six? That's unusual. What's the story behind it?" Sarah paused in her inspection and looked at the young sergeant. Most pilots' call signs had obvious origins. Ghost for someone who was quiet, Thunder for someone who was loud, Eagle Eye for someone with exceptional vision. But Sticky Six was different, and Sarah had learned over the years that the story behind it often preceded her into new assignments. "It's a long story," Sarah said with a slight smile. "Maybe I'll tell you about it when we get back." What Sarah didn't say was that the name had come from her very first combat mission 3 years earlier. She had been tasked with extracting a wounded soldier from a hot landing zone under heavy enemy fire. The designated extraction point had been overrun, and the only available space was a rooftop that was 6 inches narrower than her rotor diameter on each side. The other pilots in her unit had said it was impossible. Command had been ready to abort the mission and leave the wounded soldier to be evacuated by ground forces, which would have taken hours he didn't have. But Sarah had looked at the measurements, calculated the risk, and decided that 6 inches was enough margin if you were good enough. She had hovered that Black Hawk over the rooftop with precision that defied belief, holding position in gusty winds while enemy fire erupted around them. The rotor blades had cleared the walls on both sides by exactly 3 inches, half of her calculated margin. But she had held that hover for the full 90 seconds it took to get the wounded soldier aboard, and then she had lifted off and flown him to safety. When they landed back at base, her crew chief had said she was sticky as glue in tough situations, and another pilot had added that she could stick a helicopter in a 6-inch space if she had to. The name Sticky Six had stuck, and it had followed her through every assignment since. But that was a story for another time. Right now, they had a mission to focus on. The final mission briefing took place at 0800 hours in a secure conference room adjacent to the operations tent. Sarah sat at a table with Major Thompson and his team, while Colonel Williams and the intelligence officer Captain Park presented the latest information about enemy activities in the target area. Overnight surveillance shows increased movement around the primary objective, Captain Park reported, pointing to recent satellite images displayed on a large monitor. We count at least 15 personnel, possibly more. They appear to be moving supplies into the cave system. Any change in defensive positions? Sarah asked. Negative. They're still concentrated in the valleys and at the established landing zones. No indication they're expecting an approach from the north. Major Thompson studied the images carefully. What about our extraction? Same route. Sarah shook her head. Extraction will be from a different location entirely. Once you complete your reconnaissance and call for pickup, I'll come in from the east and land in the valley. By then, stealth won't matter, speed will. And if the landing zone is hot, one of Thompson's soldiers asked. Then, we'll make it unhot, Sarah replied simply. Colonel Williams looked up from his notes. Weather forecast shows clear skies tonight. Winds from the southwest at 8 to 12 knots. Moon phase is new, so visibility will be minimal. That's what we're counting on, Sarah said. The briefing continued for another hour, covering every aspect of the mission from radio frequencies to emergency procedures. Each team member had specific responsibilities, and each understood exactly what would happen in various contingency situations. The mark of a professional military operation was not just having a good primary plan, but having good backup plans for when the primary plan went wrong. As the briefing concluded, Major Thompson approached Sarah privately. Captain, I want you to know that my team has complete confidence in your abilities. We've heard about your previous missions, and we know we're in good hands. Thank you, Major. But let's save the congratulations until we're all back safe. The rest of the day passed slowly as Sarah and her crew completed their final preparations. Rodriguez performed additional maintenance checks, while Sarah studied meteorological data and calculated fuel consumption for various scenarios. The other crew member, Corporal James, tested all communication and navigation equipment repeatedly. As evening approached, the tension on the base became palpable. Word had spread that a high-risk mission was planned for that night, though the specific details remained classified. Personnel moved with the heightened awareness that always accompanied dangerous operations, and conversations were more subdued than usual. Sarah ate dinner alone in the mess tent, preferring to keep her mind focused on the mission ahead rather than engaging in casual conversation. She reviewed her mental checklist one more time, visualizing each phase of the flight from takeoff to landing. In her mind, she flew the route repeatedly, imagining every possible scenario and her response to each one. At 2,200 hours, the team gathered at the flight line for final equipment checks and mission briefing updates. The desert night was surprisingly cool, and a light breeze stirred the sand around their feet. Stars blazed overhead in the clear sky, providing just enough ambient light to see without requiring night vision equipment. Major Thompson's team had painted their faces with camouflage and wore full combat gear. Each soldier carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, communications gear, and specialized reconnaissance equipment. They moved with the easy confidence of professionals who had done this many times before. Sarah completed her final pre-flight inspection by flashlight, checking every system one last time. The helicopter had been refueled and rearmed, and all systems showed green across the board. Rodriguez and James took their positions, while the Special Operations team prepared to board. "Comm check," Sarah said into her headset. "Crew chief, good," Rodriguez replied. "Dorganer, good," James said. "Team leader, good," Major Thompson said. One by one, each team member confirmed their communications were working properly. In the mountains where they were going, reliable communications could mean the difference between successful extraction and being stranded in hostile territory. At 2,330 hours, Sarah started the engines. The familiar whine of turbines spinning up filled the night air, followed by the rhythmic beating of rotor blades beginning to turn. Inside the aircraft, red lights provided just enough illumination to see instruments and equipment without destroying night vision. "All stations, this is Sticky 6, Sarah announced on the radio. "Requesting permission to depart. Sticky 6, this is Tower. You are cleared for departure. Godspeed." Sarah pulled pitch gently, and the Black Hawk lifted off into the dark night sky. Below them, the lights of the forward operating base grew smaller and dimmer until they disappeared entirely. Ahead lay 40 kilometers of hostile territory, and the most challenging insertion any of them had ever attempted. As they climbed to their cruise altitude, Sarah felt the familiar calm that always came over her during dangerous missions. All the planning was done, all the preparation was complete. Now it was just her aircraft, and her skill against whatever challenges lay ahead. But even she couldn't have predicted what would happen in the next few hours, or how this mission would prove once, and for all why her call sign had become legendary throughout the military. In the darkness ahead, enemy forces were waiting with weapons and determination. Mountain peaks loomed like dark teeth against the star-filled sky. And somewhere in those mountains, success and failure balanced on the edge of a knife. Sticky 6 was about to prove why some names become legendary. The Black Hawk flew through the night like a ghost, its engines muffled by the vast emptiness of the desert. Sarah maintained an altitude of 500 feet above ground level, high enough to avoid small arms fire, but low enough to stay under radar detection. The aircraft's navigation systems painted a green glow across her night vision goggles, showing their position relative to known threats and objectives. 20 minutes into the flight, they reached the first checkpoint. Sarah keyed her radio once to acknowledge their position to base, but maintained radio silence otherwise. Any unnecessary transmissions could be intercepted by enemy forces who were known to monitor coalition frequencies. In the back of the aircraft, Major Thompson and his team sat in disciplined silence, each man focused on his own mental preparation for the mission ahead. The tension was palpable, but it was the controlled tension of professionals who knew their jobs and trusted their equipment and training. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez monitored the aircraft's systems from his position, his eyes constantly scanning instrument readouts and watching for any sign of mechanical problems. At this distance from base, a significant mechanical failure would mean landing in hostile territory and waiting for rescue, assuming rescue was possible. "Checkpoint 2 in sight," Sarah announced quietly over the intercom. Ahead, the terrain began to change from flat desert to rolling hills that marked the beginning of the mountain range. The real challenge was about to begin. Sarah began a gradual climb as the ground rose beneath them. The aircraft's engines worked harder in the thin mountain air, and she adjusted her power settings to compensate. Every change had to be smooth and gradual to avoid detection by anyone who might be listening for the sound of approaching aircraft. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape below became increasingly rugged and forbidding. Deep valleys cut between razor-sharp ridges, and sheer cliff faces dropped away into bottomless darkness. This was terrain that had claimed aircraft and crews throughout military history, even under ideal conditions. But these were far from ideal conditions. Movement on the ground, 2 o'clock, Rodriguez reported quietly. Sarah looked in the direction he indicated and saw vehicle lights moving along a dirt road far below. According to their intelligence briefing, enemy forces regularly used that road to transport supplies and personnel to their mountain positions. The timing of their insertion had been carefully planned to avoid these supply convoys, but timing was never perfect in combat operations. "I see them," Sarah replied. "We're high enough and far enough away. They won't see us." She was right. The vehicle lights continued their journey without any indication that their occupants had detected the helicopter passing overhead. But the sighting served as a reminder that they were now deep in hostile territory, where discovery could mean death in a matter of seconds. The approach to the target area required flying through a narrow canyon with walls rising on both sides. Sarah had studied this canyon extensively during mission planning, but seeing it through night vision goggles was dramatically different from studying photographs and topographical maps. The canyon walls seemed to close in around them as they flew deeper into the mountains. Sarah had to make constant adjustments to her heading and altitude to keep the aircraft centered in the available airspace. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and the rotor blades would strike rock with catastrophic results. "Canyon walls are getting closer," Rodriguez observed, his voice steady despite the obvious danger of their situation. "I see them," Sarah replied. "We're fine. Plenty of clearance." But plenty of clearance was relative. The canyon was barely wide enough for the Black Hawk's rotor diameter, and Sarah was flying by instruments and night vision in complete darkness. A sudden wind gust or momentary vertigo could push them into the canyon walls before there was time to react. As they progressed deeper into the canyon, enemy positions became visible on the higher elevations. Sarah could see the faint glow of campfires and the occasional flash of a cigarette lighter. These were the positions that had made previous insertion attempts impossible, but from their current approach route, the enemy sentries were looking down into the valleys, not up at the canyon they were flying through. "Target area coming up," Major Thompson announced over the intercom. 2 minutes to insertion. Sarah began her descent toward the narrow ridge that would serve as their landing zone. According to her calculations, the ridge was exactly 22 feet wide, just enough room for the Black Hawk's landing gear with less than 3 feet of clearance on each side. In daylight, with calm winds and unlimited visibility, it would be a challenging landing. At night, in hostile territory, with the possibility of enemy fire at any moment, it was barely possible. 1 minute to insertion, Sarah announced. The ridge appeared in her night vision system as a thin line of light against the dark mountain slopes. As they approached, Sarah could see that the intelligence had been accurate. It was a natural formation that provided just enough level space for a helicopter to land, assuming the pilot had exceptional skill and steady nerves. 30 seconds, Sarah called out. Major Thompson and his team prepared for immediate departure from the aircraft. They had practiced this insertion dozens of times, and each man knew exactly what he needed to do. The moment the helicopter touched down, they would have less than 15 seconds to exit the aircraft before Sarah would have to lift off again. Sarah began her final approach to the ridge, every sense focused on the delicate task of placing the aircraft precisely where it needed to be. The slightest miscalculation would send them tumbling down the mountainside, or, worse, alert enemy forces to their presence. 10 seconds, she announced. The ridge filled her entire field of view as the Black Hawk descended toward the narrow landing zone. Sarah could feel the aircraft's response to every tiny control input, could sense the exact position of each landing gear relative to the available space. 5 seconds. The aircraft settled toward the ridge with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Sarah's hands moved on the controls with minute adjustments, correcting for a slight crosswind that threatened to push them sideways off the narrow surface. "Contact," Rodriguez announced as the landing gear touched down on the ridge. "Go, go, go," Major Thompson commanded. The Special Operations team moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing his exact route out of the aircraft. In 12 seconds, all 6 team members were on the ground with their equipment, and Major Thompson gave Sarah a thumbs-up sign. Sarah pulled pitch immediately, lifting the Black Hawk off the ridge and climbing away from the mountainside. The insertion had been perfect, silent, invisible, and successful. Phase 1 of the mission was complete. But as Sarah banked the aircraft to begin the return flight to base, enemy muzzle flashes suddenly lit up the night sky around them. Someone had spotted the helicopter during the insertion, and now automatic weapons fire was converging on their position from multiple directions. "Taking fire," Rodriguez shouted over the intercom as bullets pinged off the aircraft's armor. Sarah threw the Black Hawk into an aggressive evasive maneuver, diving toward the valley floor while turning hard to the left. More muzzle flashes appeared on the ridgelines around them, and the characteristic crack of bullets passing close to the aircraft filled the air. "Engine temperature rising," Corporal James reported. "We may have taken a hit." Sarah's mind raced through emergency procedures while she continued evasive maneuvers. They were still 15 minutes away from friendly territory, and a damaged aircraft would be unlikely to make it that far. But returning to the insertion point would compromise the Special Operations team, and landing anywhere else in this terrain would be suicide. "How bad is the engine situation?" she asked James while pulling the aircraft through another sharp turn to avoid a concentrated burst of fire from a hidden position. "Temperature is in the yellow zone, but holding steady. We might have lost some cooling fluid, but the engine is still producing power." That was good news, but Sarah knew that engine problems had a way of getting worse under stress. They needed to get clear of the enemy fire and assess their situation before making any decisions about continuing the mission or attempting an emergency landing. More weapons fire erupted from positions that hadn't been marked on any intelligence map. The enemy had obviously prepared for the possibility of an insertion attempt, even if they hadn't known exactly when or where it would occur. Sarah realized that they had flown into a carefully prepared trap. But Sticky Six hadn't earned her reputation by avoiding traps. She had earned it by flying out of them. Sarah pushed the Black Hawk to its limits, using every piece of cover the mountainous terrain provided while maintaining enough speed to stay ahead of the ground fire. She flew between peaks, through valleys, and around ridgelines with a precision that defied belief, all while enemy fire continued to light up the darkness around them. "Base, this is Sticky Six," she transmitted. "Insertion complete, but we are taking heavy fire and may have sustained damage. Request immediate support." "Sticky Six, this is Base. Copy your transmission. Support aircraft are launching now, but they are 15 minutes out. Can you maintain position?" Sarah looked at her engine temperature gauge, which was now approaching the red zone. She could hear a slight change in the engine's sound that suggested more serious problems developing. 15 minutes might be too long to wait. "Negative, Base. We need to clear the area immediately. We'll advise when clear of hostile fire." Sarah made a decision that would become part of military legend. Instead of continuing to flee from the enemy positions, she turned the damaged Black Hawk directly toward the largest concentration of muzzle flashes and began an aggressive attack run. "What are you doing?" Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with concern. "Something they won't expect," Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. What happened next would prove why some pilots become legends, and why the name Sticky Six would be remembered long after the war was over. Sarah pushed the Black Hawk into a steep dive directly toward the enemy positions, the aircraft's damaged engine screaming in protest as she demanded maximum power. What she was attempting went against every rule of helicopter combat tactics, but sometimes the most unexpected move was the only move that worked. "Sticky Six, what's your status?" came the urgent transmission from base. "We're making our own exit strategy," Sarah replied tersely, her hands flying over the controls as she lined up the aircraft for what could only be described as an impossible maneuver. The enemy fighters on the ridgelines had been firing upward at what they expected to be a fleeing helicopter. They were completely unprepared for an aircraft diving straight down at them at maximum speed. Their muzzle flashes, which had been their weapon, now became their weakness as they revealed their exact positions to Sarah's targeting systems. "Crew, prepare for aggressive maneuvering," Sarah announced over the intercom. "This is going to get rough." Rodriguez and James braced themselves as Sarah pulled the Black Hawk through a series of maneuvers that tested both the aircraft and crew to their absolute limits. She used the mountainous terrain like a fighter pilot would use clouds, disappearing behind ridgelines and reappearing in unexpected locations. The enemy fire became increasingly sporadic as the gunners lost track of the helicopter's position. Sarah's unconventional tactics had turned their prepared ambush into chaos, but she knew they couldn't maintain these aggressive maneuvers much longer. The engine temperature was now deep in the red zone, and she could see oil pressure beginning to drop. "Engine oil pressure is falling fast," James reported, his voice tight with concern. "We need to find somewhere to land now." Sarah's mind raced through the available options. They were still deep in hostile territory, surrounded by enemy positions on all sides. A forced landing would mean capture or death for her crew, and it would compromise the special operations team they had just inserted. But continuing to fly with a failing engine would likely result in catastrophic mechanical failure and a crash that would kill them all. It was then that Sarah noticed something on her navigation display that changed everything. A narrow valley ran along the eastern edge of the mountain range, parallel to their current position. According to the topographical data, it was too narrow for normal helicopter operations, but it might provide a way out if she could reach it before the engine failed completely. "Hold on," she announced, banking the aircraft hard to the right. "We're going to try something." The valley she was heading for was barely wider than the Black Hawk's rotor diameter, with walls that rose nearly vertical on both sides. Flying through it would require absolute precision, especially with a damaged aircraft, but it was their only chance of reaching friendly territory before the engine quit entirely. As they entered the valley, the aircraft was completely hidden from enemy observation on the ridgelines above. The sudden silence from enemy fire was almost eerie after the intense combat of the previous few minutes. But Sarah knew they weren't safe yet. They were now flying through a natural corridor with no room for error and no possibility of emergency landing. "Valley walls are tight," Rodriguez observed, watching the rocky surfaces blur past just feet from the rotor tips. "How long is this valley?" "According to the map, about 12 kilometers," Sarah replied, her eyes never leaving the instrument panel. "If we can make it through, we'll be in friendly airspace." The damaged engine continued to lose power, forcing Sarah to make constant adjustments to maintain airspeed and altitude. She could feel the aircraft's performance degrading with each passing minute, but they were committed now. There was no turning back in a valley this narrow. Halfway through the valley, disaster struck. The engine oil pressure dropped to zero, and warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. Sarah had perhaps 90 seconds of engine life remaining before complete mechanical failure. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Sticky 6, she transmitted. "We have complete engine failure and are attempting emergency landing in hostile territory." "Sticky 6, this is Rescue 1, came an immediate response. "We are airborne and en route to your position. Can you maintain flight?" Sarah looked at the engine instruments and shook her head, even though the rescue pilot couldn't see her. "Negative, Rescue 1. Engine failure is imminent. We're going down." But even as she said the words, Sarah spotted something that gave her hope. At the end of the valley, where it opened into friendly territory, there was a small clearing, barely large enough for a helicopter, but possibly their salvation if she could reach it before the engine quit completely. "I see a possible landing zone," she announced to her crew. "It's going to be close." The engine's death rattle was becoming audible over the rotor noise as Sarah nursed every last bit of power from the failing turbine. The aircraft was losing altitude steadily, and she had to use every trick she knew to keep them airborne long enough to reach the clearing. With the valley walls flashing past on both sides, Sarah realized that this was what her entire career had been building toward. Every hour of training, every dangerous mission, every difficult landing had prepared her for this moment when skill and courage would determine whether her crew lived or died. The engine finally seized completely just as they cleared the valley mouth. Sarah immediately entered auto-rotation, using the aircraft's forward momentum to keep the rotor turning and provide some measure of control for the emergency landing. But auto-rotation required altitude and airspeed, and she had very little of either. "Brace for impact," she shouted as the ground rushed up toward them. Sarah flared the aircraft at the last possible second, trading airspeed for a reduction in descent rate. The Black Hawk hit the ground hard, bounced once, and settled into the small clearing with a grinding crash of metal against rock. For a moment, there was complete silence except for the sound of the rotor winding down. Then, Rodriguez's voice cut through the quiet. "Everyone okay?" One by one, each crew member reported that they were alive and uninjured. The aircraft was a total loss. The engine was destroyed, the landing gear was collapsed, and the fuselage was cracked in several places. But they had made it to friendly territory, and they were alive. "Sticky 6, this is Rescue 1, came the radio transmission. "We see your position. Are you secure?" "Rescue 1, this is Sticky 6 on ground. Aircraft is destroyed, but crew is safe. We are in friendly territory and ready for pickup." As they waited for the rescue helicopter to arrive, Sarah's crew looked at her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. What she had just accomplished, fighting their way out of an enemy ambush with a damaged aircraft, flying through an impossibly narrow valley, and executing a successful emergency landing with a completely failed engine, was beyond the capabilities of most pilots. But Sarah wasn't thinking about what she had accomplished. She was thinking about Major Thompson and his team, who were still in enemy territory completing their mission. They would need extraction in a few hours, and she had just crashed the helicopter that was supposed to pick them up. "Base, this is Sticky 6, she transmitted. "I need to speak with Colonel Williams immediately. We have a mission to complete." What Sarah didn't know was that word of their escape had already spread throughout the military communications network. The story of how Sticky 6 had fought her way out of an enemy ambush and saved her crew was being told and retold, growing more legendary with each telling. By the time the rescue helicopter arrived to pick them up, Sarah Martinez had become something more than just a skilled pilot. She had become a symbol of what was possible when training, courage, and determination came together in the face of impossible odds. But the mission wasn't over yet, and Sticky 6 still had work to do. The most challenging part of her legendary night was still ahead of her. 3 hours after the crash, Sarah stood in the operations tent facing Colonel Williams, her flight suit torn and stained, but her resolve unshaken. The rescue helicopter had brought her crew back to base safely, but Major Thompson's team was still in the mountains, and their extraction window was rapidly approaching. "Captain, I understand your dedication to the mission," Colonel Williams said, his voice heavy with concern. "But you've just been through a traumatic experience. You need medical evaluation and rest." "Sir, with respect, what I need is another aircraft," Sarah replied firmly. "Major Thompson's team is counting on extraction in 4 hours. They've completed their reconnaissance and gathered critical intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. We can't leave them out there." The base medical officer, Dr. Chun, stepped forward with a tablet in his hands. "Captain Martinez, I've reviewed your medical status. While you show no signs of serious injury, you've been exposed to significant stress and physical trauma. I cannot recommend you for flight duty at this time." Sarah looked at the medical officer, then back at Colonel Williams. Around the operations tent, other personnel had gathered to listen to the conversation. Word of her escape from the mountains had spread throughout the base, and everyone knew that the Special Operations Team was still waiting for extraction. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern," Sarah said, "but I'm the only pilot here who knows the exact location of the extraction point, and I'm the only pilot who has successfully flown in those mountains at night. Major Thompson's team is in an isolated valley with limited communication capabilities. If we send someone else, there's a high probability the extraction will fail." Colonel Williams studied a map spread across his desk. "We have other qualified pilots, Martinez. Captain Johnson has extensive mountain flying experience, and Lieutenant Colonel Park knows the area well." "Yes, sir, but they don't know the specific challenges of that terrain at night. The extraction point is in a narrow valley with unpredictable wind patterns and limited approach options. It requires local knowledge that can only be gained through experience." As they spoke, a communications specialist approached the group with an urgent message. "Sir, we just received a transmission from the reconnaissance team. They're reporting increased enemy activity in their area. They need immediate extraction." Colonel Williams looked at the message, then at Sarah. The decision he had to make was clear, but difficult. Sarah was undoubtedly the best pilot for the extraction mission, but she had just survived a helicopter crash and was operating under extreme stress. On the other hand, Major Thompson's team was in immediate danger and needed the best possible chance of successful extraction. "Captain Johnson," Colonel Williams called to another pilot who had been listening to the conversation. "What's your assessment of the extraction mission?" Captain Johnson, a veteran pilot with over 15 years of experience, shook his head slowly. "Sir, I've studied the approach routes and the terrain. It's extremely challenging flying, especially at night. If Captain Martinez thinks she's the best option for the mission, I'm inclined to agree with her." Dr. Chun stepped forward again. "Colonel, I must protest. Captain Martinez has been through significant trauma tonight. The stress of another dangerous mission so soon after a crash could impair her judgment and reflexes." Sarah looked directly at the medical officer. "Doctor, with respect, my judgment and reflexes are what got my crew out of those mountains alive tonight. Major Thompson's team trusted me to get them into position, and now they're trusting me to get them out. I won't let them down." The room fell silent as everyone waited for Colonel Williams' decision. Through the tent walls, they could hear the sounds of normal base operations continuing, generators running, vehicles moving, and radio chatter from other missions. But everyone in the operations tent knew that 6 lives hung in the balance. Finally, Colonel Williams spoke. "Captain Martinez, I'm going to authorize you for the extraction mission, but with conditions. You'll have a full medical team standing by during pre-flight, and if there's any indication that you're not at full capability, the mission will be scrubbed immediately." "Understood, sir. Furthermore, Captain Johnson will fly as your wingman in a second aircraft. If you experience any difficulties during the extraction, he'll be there to assist or take over the mission." Sarah nodded. "That's acceptable, sir." And finally, the colonel continued, "This is a one-time exception. After this mission, you're grounded for 72 hours for complete medical and psychological evaluation." "Yes, sir." As the group dispersed to prepare for the extraction mission, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah with a concerned expression. "Captain, are you sure you're ready for this? That crash was pretty rough, and flying back into those mountains." Sarah put her hand on Rodriguez's shoulder. "Mike, I've been flying helicopters for 12 years. I've never lost a crew, and I've never failed to complete a mission. I'm not about to start tonight." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Then, let's go get our people." The preparation for the extraction mission proceeded with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized the original insertion. Sarah selected a different aircraft, a newer Black Hawk with upgraded navigation systems and improved armor protection. She and Rodriguez performed an exhaustive pre-flight inspection, while Captain Johnson prepared the wingman aircraft. As they worked, word continued to spread throughout the base about the night's events. Sarah had become the subject of conversations in every tent and bunker. Soldiers who had served with her before weren't surprised by her actions, but Newcomers to the base were amazed by stories of her escape from the mountains and her determination to return for the extraction. Sergeant First Class Santos, the communications specialist from Major Thompson's team, approached Sarah during the aircraft preparation. "Captain, I wanted to thank you for what you did tonight. Getting our team into position safely was incredible flying." "Don't thank me yet," Sarah replied. "Thank me when everyone's back home safe." Santos smiled. "I heard about your call sign from some of the other soldiers. They told me the story about the rooftop extraction and how you got the name Sticky Six. After tonight, I think that story's going to need an update." Sarah paused in her pre-flight check. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sticking to impossible missions is becoming your specialty. The whole base is talking about how you fought your way out of an ambush and crash-landed without losing a single crew member. Some of the veterans are saying it's the most impressive flying they've ever seen." As Santos walked away, Sarah realized that the events of this night had changed something fundamental about how others viewed her capabilities. Sticky Six had begun as a call sign based on one exceptional mission, but it was evolving into something larger, a symbol of what was possible when skill met determination. The extraction mission launched at 0330 hours, 2 hours before dawn. Sarah led the formation of 2 Black Hawks into the same mountain range where she had nearly died just hours earlier. But this time, they approached from a different direction, using lessons learned from the earlier mission. The flight to the extraction point was uneventful, but Sarah remained hyper-vigilant for any signs of enemy activity. The reconnaissance team had reported increased movement in the area, which suggested that their presence had been detected and enemy forces were actively searching for them. "Extraction point in sight," Sarah announced as they approached the narrow valley where Major Thompson's team was waiting. Beginning approach. The valley was even more challenging than the insertion point, with steep walls on 3 sides and only one viable approach route. Sarah had to execute a steep descent while maintaining precise control in gusty wind conditions. Captain Johnson held position at a higher altitude, ready to provide covering fire if enemy forces appeared. "I have visual on the team," Rodriguez reported. 6 personnel, all appear mobile. Sarah brought the Black Hawk into a hover over the small clearing where the Special Operations team was waiting. Major Thompson and his soldiers moved with the same professional efficiency they had displayed during insertion, loading their equipment and personnel in less than 20 seconds. "All personnel aboard," Major Thompson reported. "Ready for departure." Sarah pulled pitch and climbed out of the valley as quickly as possible. The extraction had been successful, but they weren't safe until they reached friendly territory. As they cleared the mountains and headed back toward base, Sarah felt the tension of the night finally beginning to ease. "Base, this is Sticky Six," she transmitted. "Extraction complete. All personnel accounted for and returning to base." "Sticky Six, this is base. Outstanding work. You're cleared direct to base." As they flew through the pre-dawn darkness toward home, Major Thompson approached Sarah over the intercom. "Captain, on behalf of my entire team, thank you. What you accomplished tonight, both the insertion and coming back for us after your crash, goes beyond the call of duty. Major, it's my job to get you in and get you out safely. Mission accomplished." But as they approached the base and Sarah saw the landing lights in the distance, she knew that this mission had been about more than just professional duty. It had been about proving that some commitments are so fundamental that they transcend personal safety and conventional wisdom. The landing was smooth and precise, a perfect into an imperfect night. As Sarah shut down the engines and completed her post-flight procedures, she was surrounded by personnel who had gathered to welcome the team home. Colonel Williams was among the first to greet her as she climbed out of the aircraft. "Captain Martinez, what you accomplished tonight will be remembered for a long time. You've set a standard that will inspire pilots for years to come." As Sarah walked across the flight line, surrounded by her crew and the soldiers she had rescued, she finally understood why her call sign had become more than just a name. Sticky Six represented something that every military professional aspired to, the ability to succeed when success seemed impossible, to persevere when others would quit, and to honor commitments even when the personal cost was extreme. Years later, when new pilots arrived at bases around the world, they would hear stories about Sticky Six and the night she proved why some names become legendary. They would learn that excellence in military aviation isn't just about technical skill or courage. It's about the determination to complete the mission no matter what obstacles stand in the way. And they would understand that when someone asks about your call sign, they're really asking about the moment you proved who you truly are.